All right, today we are diving deep into the story of Tom Barrack. He's one of the most powerful and, yeah, one of the most controversial figures in modern American foreign policy. We're talking about the private equity billionaire who, as President Trump's go-to guy, basically single-handedly rewired U.S. policy in the Middle East. So, let's get into how he pulled it off.
You know, this one quote says it all. Delivered right in the heart of the Gulf, it just perfectly sums up the radical philosophy of the man who became America's unofficial viceroy in the Levant. This signals a complete break from decades of pushing for democracy. And honestly, it's the key to understanding everything that came next.
So, who is this guy, and how in the world did he get to wield such incredible power? Well, Tom Barrack is not your typical diplomat, not by a long shot. He's a dealmaker, a real estate tycoon, and, crucially, President Trump's longtime friend and fixer. He was the one tasked with navigating the insanely complex world of Middle Eastern realpolitik. So on paper, his titles are U.S. Ambassador to Turkey and Special Envoy for Syria. But his real power? That comes from a 40-year relationship with Donald Trump, a bond that was forged way back in 1988 with the sale of the Plaza Hotel. See, Trump sees him as a killer negotiator, but more importantly, he sees him as someone who stayed loyal through everything. And it's that absolute trust that lets him operate completely outside the normal diplomatic channels. He looks at the region through what some analysts are calling a neo-Ottoman lens. Basically, he favors strong, centralized powers, kind of like the old Ottoman Empire, as the best solution to all the modern chaos. Okay, so this brings us to the very core of his strategy. It's a philosophy that takes the cutthroat logic of his business career and applies it directly to the delicate art of diplomacy. He looks at a world full of failing states and doesn't see human tragedies. He sees distressed assets, just ripe for a corporate-style takeover. The official name for this is transactional realism, and think of it like this. A failed state is basically a bankrupt company. The goal isn't to save every employee or fix every little problem. The goal is to restructure the whole business so it becomes stable and, profitable. And what that means is that old partnerships, even with some of your most loyal allies, can suddenly be seen as toxic assets that need to be liquidated if they're no longer helping the bottom line. And this slide, it just lays out the stark difference. For decades, U.S. policy was all about building alliances based on shared democratic values. The Barrack Doctrine, it tosses that out in favor of purely transactional deals with strong men who can guarantee stability. Now, this didn't just happen out of nowhere. It really grew from this deep frustration with what many saw as the failures of past interventions, all the inconclusive nation-building and the so-called endless wars. Barrack's approach replaces sanctions with investment and arguments over human rights with partnership. It is a complete 180 from decades of American foreign policy. This quote right here, it just perfectly sums up that corporate mindset driving all these changes. Barrack has zero patience for the endless bureaucratic processes of the State Department. He is not interested in talking just for the sake of talking. He wants decisive, disruptive action that forces a resolution and gets a result, no matter how much controversy it kicks up. So now let's look at the ultimate test case for this whole doctrine, the shattered state of Syria. This is where he really put his theory into practice, and on a massive scale. This is where the rubber meets the road. After the Assad regime finally collapsed, this was the central question facing Washington. The country was in ruins, it was fragmented, and it was a total breeding ground for instability. So Barrack was sent in with one simple mandate: fix it. And his solution was, well, it was audacious. His plan was a classic three-step corporate restructuring. First step, clean up the management. He basically rebranded the new leader Ahmed al-Sharaa, shifting his image from a militant past to a legitimate partner for the West. Second step, recapitalize the business. He got sanctions lifted, which allowed Gulf allies to pour in billions for rebuilding. And the third, final step, consolidate all assets. That meant forcing the US-backed Kurdish SDF to completely dissolve and merge into the Syrian National Army.
And boy, did the money follow. Almost immediately, an initial wave of $7.8 billion from Qatar and the UAE poured into Syria's energy and infrastructure sectors. For Barrack and the Trump administration, this was the perfect deal. They were achieving their policy goals, stabilizing Syria, without spending a single American taxpayer dollar.
Now, Barrack hailed this deal as a historic milestone. But let's be real. Let's look at the fine print. The Kurds handed over all their territory. They gave up control of the oil fields that funded their entire autonomous project. And they agreed to dissolve their independent military force. And what did they get in return? A vague promise of cultural rights.
In essence, their entire political and military project was liquidated, traded away for a symbolic gesture.
This grand bargain, it didn't just end the war in Syria. No, it sent shockwaves across the entire Middle East. It completely redrew the power map, creating some very clear winners, some very clear losers, and leaving some of America's traditional allies absolutely furious. The biggest winner by a country mile was Turkey. For years, Ankara's #1 goal was to prevent a Kurdish autonomous state from taking root on its southern border. Tom Barrack delivered that goal to them on a silver platter. He effectively outsourced regional security to President Erdogan and elevated Turkey to the undisputed top dog of the northern Levant. So how is this all justified? Well, in Barrack's own chilling words, the U.S. partnership with the Kurds, the same Kurds who fought and died alongside American soldiers to defeat ISIS, had largely expired. You see, they weren't treated like allies. They were treated like a vendor contract whose services were just no longer required. It is the coldest, most brutal expression of transactional realism you can possibly imagine.
And on the other side of that ledger, you've got Israel. The traditional cornerstone of U.S. policy in the region suddenly found itself completely sidelined. Barrack's praise for monarchies, his public questioning of Israel's own democracy, and his empowerment of Turkey, it all created this deep, deep distrust. It reportedly got so bad that Prime Minister Netanyahu accused the top American envoy of actively working against Israeli interests.
Finally, you just can't talk about Tom Barrack without addressing the cloud of controversies that seem to follow him everywhere, constantly blurring that line between public service and private interest.
And this slide really outlines the pattern here. I mean, sure, he was acquitted of acting as an agent for the UAE, but the trial itself revealed this habit of mixing political access with business deals. Add to that a really colonial-sounding insult to journalists, persistent questions about whether his policies just happened to benefit his own financial network, and a revealed connection to Jeffrey Epstein, and what you get is a diplomat who is constantly dogged by serious questions about his judgment and his ethics.
Which leaves us with a big question about his legacy, right? Was Tom Barrack a pragmatic genius who just cut through all the diplomatic nonsense to bring stability and get U.S. troops out of endless wars? Or was he a merchant of statecraft who sold out American values and loyal allies, all in the pursuit of the ultimate deal? The answer, it seems, really depends on what you value more, the result or the price that was paid to get there.